Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
that looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Translating values into policy and law is never easy and rarely quick. In this episode of Challenge 2.0, we visit with leaders from the group Faith Action Network, which represents 167 faith communities throughout the state. Those communities encompass Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, and prove the existence of common ground and shared values across different belief systems. Today, we'll discover how successful they were in achieving their goals this year in the Washington State Legislature. So to help us understand all of this, we're pleased to have in studio, for the first time, we've been doing these several years, but we have Kristen Ang, the Policy Engagement Director for FAN, and Elise DeGoyer, who is the Executive Director of FAN. And I thank you so much. It's wonderful, and our audience is going to be tired of hearing me say this, but we've been doing this via Zoom, in part because you've been so busy with the legislature for years. And now we're finally in the same room. So thank you so much. We know this was a short legislative session this year, and we're going to really focus on that. But what I'd like to do is begin by giving our viewers a sense of FAN. What was its origin? What was its source of inspiration?
So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us. And FAN was formed, Faith Action Network was formed in 2011. So we're approaching our 13th birthday. We're becoming teenagers, if you will. And it was formed out of a real need to bring together faith voices. And so Lutheran Public Policy Office had been doing this work for decades, and Washington Association of Churches. And so in talking together, they thought, how can we maximize our efforts? How can we be stronger together? And so had lots of intentional conversations about joining together in this work, building community, but also doing the policy work. And so in that joining together in 2011, they decided interfaith was the way to move forward. And that in this area of our nation, it would be wonderful, and they'd already worked across faith lines and faith traditions, but to start something new and fresh. So it was really an inspired time, and they set some really great foundations for this work, including the name, that we're rooted in faith, that we take action together, and that we're a network. You don't have to get a membership card and buy into everything, but that we find our agreements, our points of agreement, and our common ground to move forward in action.
And how does that translate to your work down in the legislature, then, that origin of the organization, then?
Well, I believe that, faith voices are very important. The moral voices are needed at the Capitol to remind people why we are there, that our budgets should reflect our values, and to simply go for it. I think as people of faith, we're not always going for what people say, like the status quo. We are going for standards of what we believe, a world that we believe in. We put in FAN a just and compassionate world, and we're willing to work at it. I think that's why our name is Faith Action Network, because we are about the prayers, we are about the thoughts, we're about the gathering, but we're going to be united in action. And we believe, and I think as people of faith, that we have faith in our system. And we have faith in each other that we're going to get this done. And we never lose hope. That's why every year, no matter what, like the death penalty, to take that out after decades, we will not give up.
So I have to ask both of you, what was your motivation to get involved with this personally? Was it an outgrowth of your personal faith life? Was it a focus on issues that then coincided with faith? Or was it something else? What's your backstories on that? Elise, I might begin with you.
So I'm a lifelong Catholic and had been really inspired as I grew and went to college by the social justice tradition of our faith. And that led me to you need to act. You need to put that into tangible form in the world. So I have mostly done faith-based, faith-sponsored social services. So run food banks, open shelters, did that hands-on tangible work of mercy. And quite often we knew that there was policy change that needed to happen, that we had to look upriver and see what the changes would be to stop people from needing food banks and being homeless. But rarely do you have time. Rarely do you have the ability to do both, or you're not funded for both.
Right.
So advocacy has always been an important part of that, and to make social change. But to focus on that from a faith perspective is where I've come through these faith-based human services to the work of policy change and social justice.
Kristen, can I ask you the same question? What was your motivation for this? What led you in the path that you're in now?
I was reflecting upon the path beforehand because 7 years ago I ran for office, and out of nowhere, and I probably was one of those people that it's like, do one person really makes a difference? And as advocacy, I don't know all of who's representing me. I was probably a regular person, but I felt like someone had to run and I couldn't find anybody else. And so I did. People thought it was going to be impossible. And also what I was running on, environmental justice, environmental economic development, addressing climate change, and collaborating with the tribes, the kind of world that I wanted to see in my area. And we won. I took a lot of, I would say it wasn't just me, there was a lot of people and organizations, but it was almost like I had to help them believe that it was possible. And I think in some cases that did rekindle my faith. That, a part of me is like, maybe it's only a person of faith that would ever take this leap, because people didn't think that it's not. They always think of my area as, that movie Dune or that book Dune. They probably hate me saying this, but that author was based in Tacoma. He was inspired by the landscape of Oregon, but the corruption and pollution was inspired by Tacoma at that time when he was there. And we have moved away from that. And so in some cases, it was this movement. And now I'm like the president of the port. I get to do all these things with the people, with the tribe, things that people didn't think were on the horizon. So for me, and then as an elected official, that's only a part-time job. So I was like, what can I do on my other side? And I was like, well, I can't be a lobbyist for so-and-so. and I'm like, who could it be? And I saw Faith Action Network, and I saw what they were about. I saw their legislative agenda. I was like, I could go with this one, because I believe in what they're doing. And I believe that all these advocates make a difference and that they have the heart. So I work with the best people. I honestly believe I work with some of the best people on our staff, and the people that I'm with, the faith leaders. These are people of character. These are people who truly believe and are making a difference in our communities, both in the political and both as in the community, because I don't think it's just about being in the seats. So it has to work all together. It's an ecosystem.
So with that ecosystem, as you put it, with your organization, as you approach this short legislative session, and you might just define that, how that's different from normal, what emerged as your major targets, as your major goals for that session?
We usually do our work in about 8 categories, and that's how our legislative agenda gets formed. It's informed by the people, by 168 faith communities across the state, and peoples in those faith communities, and even independent of those faith communities, several hundred people talking about what do they want to see. So things like economic justice and fixing our tax code. Housing and homelessness and safety net and food are always going to be core to faith communities, because they're often providing the services. But also work with immigrants and refugees, as we know from this year, as asylum seekers have arrived in our area and congregated and are not eligible for benefits. We considered, what do they need? How can this not just be a private effort to make sure that they have supports and aren't just more homeless people in our streets. Healthcare, public safety, those are those broad categories of work.
Right.
We have a wide spectrum when it comes to our legislative agenda. We don't just focus on one area, whether that's healthcare or environment or economic justice, because our faith communities care about everything. And we believe that one section affects the other. For instance, economic justice. The reason that why we're trying to improve our upside down tax code, we used to be the most regressive in terms of taxes in the United States, like the 50th. We're now 49th, Florida is last, because we have the capital gains tax, which is about $1 billion that goes to early child care and other things for our children. So we know that if we put all these tax cuts for the rich, that will be less money in programs for low to medium income families. And so we really wanted to defend that in terms of economic justice. But we also know that, for instance, we've always been about food. I think FAN has always been about for the hungry. And so we will advocate for free school meals for kids. If we can't get it, we'll try to keep on getting as much as we can. We'll get the budget. Like this year, we added $45 million in order for the state to keep its promise of the legislation we passed last year, right? And then we'll seek $12 million for summer EBT. We'll seek another $10 million for senior nutritious meals, because we see what's happening on the ground on those food banks. We hear from our faith communities that are struggling. And one of our faith communities in our network, Riverton Park, Elise has visited, has shown people, like, they have a lot of asylees and camping there. Right? And so one of the legislation that was inspired to help that was to put $25 million towards the Office of Refugees, Immigrants Assistance. And that we kept on advocating for these particular budget items and for that to pass, to help with these situations that we're seeing on the ground. And of course, number one is housing. I think last year was the year of housing. The House had put so much money, and yet this year, Housing 2.0 did not happen. There was no rent stability, capping rents at 7%. There was not the bills for more housing on transit centers, nor was there even what they call the Affordable Homes Act, REAT 2.0, House Bill 2276, in which they would have just taxed 1% more on properties sold over $3 million, on properties sold on over $3 million. And then you would have even exempted the first 750,000 or even $1 million. And that exempts most homeowners when they sell. And that would have provided a stream of funding for the Housing Trust Fund, which builds for affordable housing, as well as they would put a funding for housing for those with disabilities. And so in some cases, these are the fights we're fighting for. They're all related. We also heard from our network, because of COVID, because of things that are happening, that the youth need some mental health care. So we partnered up with NAMI. It's National Alliance for Mental Illness. And we advocated this year for a lot of these bills, hundreds of millions that are going into mental health care, as well as those specifically directed towards students and youth, because we heard from our faith communities and others that this is what we need. And the legislature this year delivered on that. They may not have delivered on Housing 2.0 for renters, but they delivered on mental health care for youth.
I guess then, and you've been dealing with some of this already in your responses, is what do you consider your biggest successes this year that met your goals?
I would highlight one that meets our goal of multi-faith, belonging, making sure no one is targeted, is the establishment of an anti-bias hotline that, much like Oregon has, that people will be able to call if they experience an incident of bias or hate and be directed through the Attorney General's office to either resources, or if it is a hate crime, they will be, sent to law enforcement. But it's just providing another layer of both reporting, of getting the help you need. And with the incredible rise of anti-Semitism in our
Right.
state, with the incredible rise of acts of Islamophobia and racism and xenophobia, we feel really good about it. The governor signed it, and
It was the largest coalition. I think that's also what's heartwarming in a time of division. That particular bill, Senate Bill 5427, Bias Incidents Hotline, had quite a multi-faith, multicultural coalition, LGBTQ. We were all united in that we needed a bias incidents hotline. We needed help. We saw with the FBI statistics that hate crimes and bias incidents were rising, and the number one targets are usually about race, and number two is religion, and number three is LGBTQ identity. And so all of us gathered together and said, we need to send a message, but we also need to provide some help. And it's also good to actually know what's going on in your state.
And we just saw an example of that with the basketball tournament being held in Spokane, where I think it was Utah. They were staying in Coeur d'Alene, so it wasn't Washington State, and there was a lot of harassment of some of their players that they said was very unfortunate. So that underscores that.
the other thing that happened this year, Jeff, that we started tracking ourselves, and so it's really good to have a different source to do that, a government source to do that, but was the attacks on churches and faith communities over the year, both during Pride Month and over several different things, flags torn down and graffiti and hate speech written in that graffiti, but also in one example in Spokane Valley, a scripture passage was written in a flammable fluid on the lawn of a faith community. Quite often, faith communities in our network have God's doors are open to all
Right.
during Pride Month or throughout the year, and those have been knocked over quite often. But in Vancouver, Washington, at the Lutheran Church, they were smashed to smithereens by a man with an axe who said he was a minister. So there have been anecdotally stories reported to us that we will continue to speak to. But when I talk to our colleagues across the nation, we had more than 20 incidents at faith communities reported just to us, and that
Right.
wasn't all of them. And other states may have one or two. So it's
Interesting.
significant.
And that's why we also advocated for increase in security grants for nonprofits and faith-based nonprofits and communities, both on the federal and state level, to increase that, because we're witnessing the rise.
As you look back at the session, as we tape this, relatively recently concluded, what would you class as your disappointments, and are those essentially speed bumps, or are they going to force a longer-term reanalysis of what you're doing?
Probably the biggest disappointment this year for a lot of advocates was housing and helping renters. House Bill 2114 had passed the House and then did not proceed in the Senate. I think this would have capped annual rent increases at 7%. We have heard from so many people how much their rents have raised, like $500, $1,000, or 20%, 30%, 40%. And that, they say we're going to build affordable housing. They're putting some money, but until then, how do we help the people that are renting?
Right.
They're going to be homeless. And these are probably people who are going to be first-time homeless, people that are homeless.
Right.
Maybe second time, but it's hard for people to keep on moving. It's really just, it impacts their lives. And then the other one was the Affordable Homes Act, which would have provided a funding stream to the Housing Trust Fund and for housing people with disabilities. That did not pass. That was also called REIT 2.0 because it would just have taxed properties a little bit more, those that are 3 million and above 3 million, I should say.
So in the state, we have citizen-sponsored initiatives. And so we talk about what happens in Olympia doesn't just stay in Olympia. We have this broader approach. And we're seeing a new twist in that landscape in terms of, I believe, a hedge fund manager who moved into the state is spending considerable money out of his own pocket to counter some of the acts of the legislature. I'd begin with just, what's your personal reaction to that, especially coming at this from a faith background?
Well, it certainly defies our values, and that a millionaire hedge fund manager, as you said, can run initiatives himself, and that defies the spirit of initiatives, which was grassroots and people. So then it goes to the legislature. These 6 initiatives went to the legislature, and that was probably one of our disappointments, is that these 6 initiatives took so much time away from an already packed session that some things weren't able to be, dealt with. But the legislature passed 3 of those, and 3 that much of what they passed was already law. So they could pass those and watch for how they impacted people. And then 3 will go to the ballot. And the 3 that went to the ballot, I would say, are tied to our disappointments on our legislative agenda, which are structural change, economic justice, creating a more fair, more just state economically.
As you're talking about that disappointment and that particular measure that deals, I think, with a capital gains tax, hone in a little bit farther on that, or a little bit more deeply on that.
So the initiative 2109 that will go to the ballot in November will undo the capital gains tax that we, along with our coalition partners, worked really hard to pass, which created another source, $5 billion, that is available for early learning. So everyone has access to good education and special ed and other things. So that will undo that. Now, they've already fought their battle in court and lost, in the Supreme Court of Washington, and lost. And the U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't hear that capital gains tax. So now it will go to the people. And we trust that the people will see that this investment in our treasury, in this treasury that's for all, would take away education from young people.
So a little bit more on Initiative 2109, because I truly believe this was the true target of that hedge fund manager, was not to have capital gains. There were only last year 3,300 filers that were affected by this particular capital gains tax. Out of so many of Washington State residents. And it was 7% on profits on stocks and bonds of $250,000 and above. And so that is not the usual taxpayer. And usually the average income of that person is $2.7 million and above. And so the people that are paying into this can pay into this. And I believe that these 3 initiatives are basically taking us backwards. The work that FAN has worked on for years, as well as our other coalition partners, would be wiped out. And I think that's why we do have to defend, the capital gains tax, so that we can have early child care learning. We have to defend, the Climate Commitment Act, because it is putting funds for the environment to combat climate change. It also makes big corporate polluters pay what we are owed. We need it for the clean energy transition. And that's Initiative 2117. And that's why we're saying no, because this takes us backwards. When Washington should be moving forward, we should have a healthy and prosperous Washington for all. And this cuts that out, cuts the funding for all of that, so that we could give these particular tax breaks to those who are already wealthy and to those that are polluting our area. And these are big corporate polluters. The other one is Initiative 2124, is basically gutting out long-term care. Everyone likely is going to need long-term care. And if you gut this out, that will take away a lot of financial stability and essential health care for many Washingtonians.
So when you look at the totality of your organization, and I think when I looked at your website last, 167 different faith communities that are involved in that, how are you advising them to move forward and respond to this challenge?
We will do education through the summer and through the fall about the impact on these initiatives, of And we will support a no vote on the 3 initiatives because we want to see a Washington that serves all of its people. And for example, the Climate Commitment Act, if we take that away, there aren't those supports for the incredible growth of asthma in the most impacted communities by climate change. So things like that we will talk. We'll talk to our members about. And we will do it within 501c3 capabilities. It's not going to be everything we do, but it's essential to what we do. It's undergirds a lot of what was possible in the legislative session. The thing I want to say is that in this session, even with those limits, we advocated for over $500 million investments in the things we cared about. And that's just in the budget, not in those bills that passed that had a monetary piece too. So we often talk about our budget as a moral document. And so how does that budget serve the most vulnerable people in our society, the most impacted people in our society?
The most pressing issues of our society, whether it's housing or healthcare for immigrants or whatnot. So often the times I would say half the session, the latter half, is all about advocating for the budget. And you can see that in our e-news and the hundreds of letters that come from our faith community members that are just getting their legislators to give more in this particular area because we do need it, whether that's food banks or housing.
Well, as always, it's inspiring to hear of your work and always informative to hear of what you're doing. And I think based on our discussion here, there's going to be no shortage of things for us to talk about the next time we get together. So thank you both so much for making the trek into the studio. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of Challenge 2.0. We hope you'll join us again next week. Thank you.